Hello and welcome to the Thursday, August 1st, 2013 Audit Committee meeting. We'll call the meeting to order. First thing we need to do is get approval of the minutes. The meeting held Thursday, June 6th.
Move approval, Aguilar.
Second, Rolfing.
We have that motion to approve. It's been seconded as well. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Very good. Thank you. Want to make sure we welcome Jason and Arnie. We appreciate them coming on a day like today. The rest of us have to be here, but we appreciate their involvement. We've got several reports to get to today, so we'll start it right off with the ambulance service agreement. Who's doing that one, Rich?
I'll take that one. You look on when I was reviewing the report, I found a typo on page 3, by the way, where it says a glossary of common terms is included. It's on page 12 instead of page 11. Just so I'll make that change. Why did we do this audit? Well, it was a request from management and elected officials when we solicited input for this year's annual audit plan. So this was the first audit that we've done of this agreement. And the city has had this agreement, I believe, since 2007 with, it's a three-way agreement with REMSA, which is the Regional Emergency Medical Services Authority, and Rural Metro, who is the company, the private company that provides the emergency medical services and ambulance transport for the City of Sioux Falls. In Sioux Falls, the EMS system is designed for Sioux Falls Fire Rescue to be the first responder, and they provide what we call BLS, basic life support. The firefighters have trained the EMTs, emergency medical technicians, to begin the first aid or whatever is required. And then when Rural Metro arrives, they provide the advanced life support and the transport to the hospital if necessary. And Rural Metro has the exclusive franchise under this agreement. This current agreement that we audited expires in 2015. And if you look on page 5 of the report, up at the top we have the objectives. First objective, determine if REMSA and Rural Metro are complying with the terms of the agreement. And number 2, determine if risk associated with ambulance service agreements are being adequately mitigated. And the third was to develop ideas for management's consideration when developing a new agreement. And as far as the results, again, beginning on page 5, we looked at that compliance. We looked at those areas, those specific areas. Number 1, the response time. That's the primary performance measure of Rural Metro was the response time. B was the appropriate oversight by REMSA, especially in regard to medical oversight and the inspection of the ambulances for the proper equipment and supplies. We looked at the insurance coverage required, including the performance bond. We looked at the requirement for Rural Metro to achieve and maintain accreditation with CAS, which is the Commission on Accreditation of Ambulance Services. And also we looked at the user fees, which are approved by REMSA, and we did a statistical sample to see that the patients were being charged according to the fees that were approved by REMSA. And we found that Rural Metro was in compliance with the performance measure of response time. We have a lot of detail on that on page 5 and 6. And we found that the insurance company, or the insurance coverage was in place for the liability insurance and performance bond. We verified that. The accreditation is being maintained. In fact, they were getting ready for another site visit while we were doing the audit. And the user fees were the statistical sample that we looked at. They were the patients were being charged according to the approved fees. As far as some of the ideas that we came up with for the next agreement on page 7, just based on our research and talking to city management, we had some ideas that we came up with for consideration for the next agreement. What we'd like to see is the customer satisfaction surveys being sent by REMSA. Rural Metro does use customer satisfaction surveys of a sample of customers and shares that with REMSA. We'd prefer that for future purposes, REMSA might handle that, send out the surveys and receive those back. We had a suggestion on the uniform for the paramedics for the ambulance service that they be a different appearance and color than the Sioux Falls firefighters. In case there would be a complaint, it's easier to distinguish if it was a firefighter or if it was ambulance personnel. There's a suggestion of having a lockbox, a bank lockbox for the accounts receivable, and the city having access to that as part of the agreement. The idea would be that city, in the case of a contract default, the city would have ready access to cash. It'd be something that could obviously be negotiated with the provider. We thought about the idea, this is our idea of negotiating a certain number of standby hours. Under the current agreement, rural metro is required to provide unlimited standby hours at no charge to the city if requested. Last spring, there was a drowning incident at the Falls Park, and ambulance had to be there for many, many hours while they were doing recovery of the body efforts. It becomes quite a burden on the provider to provide unlimited standby hours. So I thought maybe something for the next contract would be, the provider will provide X number of hours per month at no charge to the city for standby. If it were to exceed that number, then the city would pay a flat fee or something that could be negotiated. I thought that'd be fair to the service provider. If we award a next contract, we'd recommend at least 5 years with an option to extend for another 5 years. I think if you go less than that and you went through the RFP process, I don't know if you'd have other companies that would be interested in going through the bother of doing a request for proposals if it was only for 3 years. So we suggested having 5 years with an option to extend for another 5 years with satisfactory performance. And the bottom of page 7 there, a lot of attention is given to that performance measure of response time. That the kind of the national standard is 8 minutes and 59 seconds 90% of the time. We considered changing that, just lowering that to 85% or 86%, because what's happening now is that the requests are made every month to waive calls that don't meet the time standard, because there's theoretically monetary penalties if you don't meet the response times. Those penalties have never been assessed. They've always been had some of their requests for exemptions to be granted, some not, but they've always been able to reach that standard. We thought it'd be a lot simpler for contract monitoring if you just come up with a flat number and don't bother with the exemptions. Just say you have to be there 86% of the time within the time standard. We thought that'd be easier. Another suggestion was maintain that inspection program. We thought that had value. Likewise, the accreditation standard, we suggested that be maintained. We suggested giving a standard for age and mileage of the ambulance that, it could be miles, it could be years, or both. A performance measure of patient outcomes should be considered. For example, a few critical areas such as cardiac arrest and trauma might be tracked for performance, because that's ultimately what people care about. I mean, you want the ambulance to be there quickly, but more importantly, you're concerned about patient outcomes. So maybe that could be tracked for some of the key areas. And I would say, if the contract could be terminated if there was a consistent pattern of lack of customer satisfaction, poor patient outcomes, or poor response time. So those are just ideas for the next agreement. The formal recommendations begin on page 8. We just had 2. That number 1, that the city go through the RFP process when this contract is nearing expiration. City's never done that. We believe that periodically opening up a public monopoly to competition helps keep providers accountable, it increases transparency, and exposes prices to competition. We don't think it's necessarily a bad idea to do that. And our suggestion was having a committee separate from REMSA to evaluate the RFPs and make a recommendation. And we had a suggestion on who might be on that committee. And then the second one relates to that. If the city council decides they want to do that, that we consider hiring a consultant to help with the RFP process. There's a lot of risk to doing a very bad RFP, such as not getting enough people to be interested in your RFP, receiving what they call a cavalier proposal, where the provider didn't thoroughly understand your requirements. How will you score the proposals, that sort of thing. There's a lot of details. There's some risk involved in that, and we thought perhaps the assistance of a consultant who has helped other local governments go through the process might be valuable. And the response from management is on page 9 there from Jill Franken, the City Health Director, who's here today also, and she had well, you can read the response. Our recommendation about CAS accreditation, she would want that to be required of the whoever submits an RFP, that they've already achieved that. Our suggestion was that maybe within the first 24 months they would achieve accreditation. And then she also had suggestions on who would compose that committee to evaluate the RFP. She had a slightly different take on our recommendation there for who would be on that committee. And also, she would like to have a cost estimate from yours truly, what it might cost to have a consultant. And so you can see the response there in the report. So overall, the rural metro was complying with the terms of the agreement, and we did see that they're meeting the performance standard of response time. REMSA is approving the medical protocols and doing the inspections of the ambulances. We didn't see any need to change the design of the system. We thought it was a high-performance model, and we didn't see any need to go through that process. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Joel Franken is here, and I believe Tim Rave is here from Rural Metro, the manager. So,
first, any questions for Rich on the audit from the audit committee? Go ahead, Councillor Rolfing.
I know there were some articles that have come out recently, just the last couple of days, on rural metro and not only their financial but their situation in some other parts of the country. Were you aware of those?
I became aware about half an hour ago. Yes.
I had read it earlier and I forgot to bring it up. Maybe I didn't read it thoroughly or anything. Are those of concern to you?
Well, as part of the audit, we looked at some of the risk involved with this, and one of the risks is obviously if you have a default for whatever reason of your provider, what do you do? We do have a contingency plan. We do require a performance bond. From Rural Metro, I verified we have that, so we would have cash available. We do have the right to lease the building and the equipment. That's part of the agreement, that if, in the case of default, for whatever reason, as I said, we would have access to the equipment, the buildings, we would have cash. So I think we have that risk mitigated by that.
If you had to step in and run it, we would hopefully have some personnel and some...
Hopefully, yeah. I mean, obviously, nobody wants to see that happen. But
right.
Yeah, that was one of the risks that we looked at to see if that was adequately mitigated. So.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Very good. I see Jill out in the audience, and this is a very complicated audit. It's the first time it's been done, if I understand right, and there's a lot of challenges ahead in doing an RFP. And Jill, would you want to add anything to help clarify anything? I just want to give you an opportunity for sure.
Sure. Again, Jill Franken, City Health Director, and I just really want to thank Rich for providing this audit. It came as a request from our department and on behalf of the REMSA board to conduct this audit. I think it's important, and the timing is really going to serve us well as we review this current agreement and making sure that everything is in compliance with this existing agreement before we start embarking on a new agreement down the road here and get prepared for 2015. I think Rich did a great job. It is a complicated audit to perform. I think there was a lot that Rich indicated that he learned in doing this audit, and a lot that helps validate what we have in place to provide quality services, timely services, and services that we can count on in our community. And so I guess, you saw my responses. I do stand by those. I think those responses, I think the recommendations were very sound. I just had a couple of thoughts that I would put forward, and that will all be taking, all the responses in total into consideration. So,
Councilor Intamin.
Jill, just a question. I don't know if this is for you or for Rich, but concerning the response times, evidently they can apply for an exception if they don't meet those response times. On an annual basis, do you have a rough idea how many exceptions are asked for?
I know that they are variable depending on the time of year, so, and related seasonally, so perhaps in the summer there may be some exceptions for, and I would ask Tim to come up and validate this, but I know that when there's high construction and there's perhaps changes where that has created a response time issue because of construction. Weather has also, played a factor in our community, and so sometimes there are, because of weather issues, that's also one. But as far as the number, I think I'm going to ask Tim because you may.
There is a little information on the bottom of page 6 of our sample. In the 4 months that we looked at, there was 228 requests, and 60% of those were approved to be waived. So.
Tim, do you have a response to that, if I might?
Well, no, again, Tim Rave from Rural Metro. I've been doing response times for this company before it was Rural Metro, so it's been 15 years I've been doing response times. And certainly, as Jill indicated, they vary month to month, seasonally. In the winter, snow, blizzard, ice, etc. Summer, usually road construction, typically. 49th and Kiwanis gets flooded. We can ask for an exemption. If you have to pull up there and it's flooded, well, you got to go around. It's not our fault. So that's really what the exemption requests are based on. That's in the contract, as Rich had put there earlier. So, yeah, I would say there's probably 30-ish a month, give or take, depending upon the situation. There's also exemptions for multiple calls at the same time or in a close proximity to each other. So you combine all of those, you get about 30 a month requests. So,
okay. If I might,
Go ahead, sure.
one more. One of the things they say here, an idea for the next agreement might possibly be looking at the response times and saying we set a standard of 85 to 86% with no exceptions permitted. What are your thoughts on that, if I might be so bold to ask?
sure. Better look at my boss. I could probably go both ways, Counselor. I think that certainly that idea, I believe they do it in other places, to go into details about if it's just if you miss your response time, if it's flat, let's say you pick 85 and that month you're at 87 and there's a $5,000 penalty per percent over, I think there are models out there similar to that. That certainly has merit. I think you have to be realistic about the number, and probably just stepping back a little bit, there's plenty of research that indicates that maybe response times aren't the end-all criteria that one should use when measuring response times. So, you taking all that into consideration, I don't know. I'm not a believer either way that one is maybe necessarily better than the other. And I think if you have them set up appropriately, it probably works out in the end both ways.
I know one more question here,
Sure.
and then I'll be done. But I know our fire station looks at placements of their stations based on what their response time is, and they work very, very hard to hit those. And I know that Rural Metro doesn't have nearly as many stations, but what is your coverage, Tim?
Well, we run 4 units during what we know to be the peak time of day, and that starts about noon and runs till 10 p.m. And so, we staff 4 units that day, and we statistically know that we run about 2.8 calls an hour on the average during those those times. And so based on those statistical historical numbers, we run 4 units because in the way you figure unit hours is a call per unit per hour. So they figure 1 call takes you an hour to turn and do another one. We know it takes a little less than that, but that's the industry standard. And so, you know, we staff accordingly. At night we have 3 units on, and we drop down after midnight. We drop down to about 1.1 calls till about 2:33 in the morning, and then we drop down to 0.8, 0.7 from about 3 in the morning till 7 or 8 in the morning. So we staff according to that. The other difference, and when you were talking about the fire department, that I would point out is, you know, when the fire department goes on a call, they go to the call, and then when they're done at the scene, they're back in service, you know, and for us, it's a continuation of probably, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes on that scene doing whatever patient care initially you do. And then 10, 12, 13 minutes to the hospital, and then turn around, getting the cot ready, you know, or I'm sorry, giving the patient to the emergency room, giving a report, turning around. So, you know, average call in town is about 40, 45 minutes where, you know, from the fire response, it's you're 5 minutes or less to get there. You're on scene maybe 10, you're done in 15. So
How many stations do you have?
3 stations, and then the 4 trucks, we double up at 1 station. So we're typically busier in this core area, so we have that 2 units over here at 10th and Williams. So,
Yeah. Thank you.
Jason?
My question was kind of piggybacking on the last 2, the 85 to 86%, Rich. Where did that number come from? And did you do the calculation to see if they would have met that standard based on the 4 months you looked at?
Yeah,
based on that
it's
number?
kind of based on those 4 months we looked at and the number of exemptions that were requested. In those 4 months we looked at, the range for our sample was about 48% of the calls they requested an exemption, and just a little over half were granted, about 60%. So just kind of a, you know, figure if you just, if you went with 85 or 86, you're probably about what it actually really is in reality. You know, the standard's 90%, but with the exemptions, then you're dropped down to that 85, 86. And that was, like I said, we picked 2 months in 2011, 2 months in 2012 to look at for our sample. And you know, when we did the research, we obviously talked to management, and we talked to Tim from Rural Metro, and we looked at things on the internet research. You know, nobody knows what the performance standard should be. I mean, obviously patient outcomes are important, but how do you measure that? That response time has been around for a long time. It's based on research, medical research, I think from the 1970s about cardiac survival. And that's kind of where they come up with this 8 minutes, 59 seconds. And now, and some people would argue, knowledgeable people, it's ridiculous, because if you showed up at 8 minutes and 50 seconds, but the patient died, you met the standard. But if you showed up, say, at 9 minutes, 30 seconds, and the patient survived, you didn't meet the standard. You know what I mean? So, I mean, just to pick that response time as your, and to focus exclusively on that is kind of, it could be not the best, but it isn't necessarily a consensus on, well, what should we use? And it's like, well, nobody's really sure. So, you know, maybe you just do a combination of some critical areas, patient outcomes, response times, you know, customer satisfaction. Who knows? But that is kind of the industry standard, though, that 8:59.
Councilor Rolfing?
Yes, Tim? The couple of questions if I could. You said neighborhood, was it a neighborhood call you called it? Or a call in a similar area? You don't send 2 ambulances in the same area at one time, is that it?
no, I'm sorry, good question for clarification. If 2 calls are dispatched at approximately the same time, we can ask for an exemption. So the theory behind that is, let's say the call was on the east side of town, and that unit was dispatched at 1700 for a call. 1703, a call comes in on the east side. The contract allows for an exemption of a call in the same area. So the second unit coming in doesn't have to meet the same response time criteria. Does that make sense?
No.
Okay, let me try one more time. Call comes in at,
Separate call, and it could be a could be a 1, 2, or, and that's the other question I want to know, the difference between code 1 and code 2, 3, and 4. And, one of them could be a code 1, one of them could be a code 4.
Yep.
And they should be separate calls.
Again, Mr. Chairman, they are, and so the first call that comes in is you can request an exemption for calls that are, the standard is not really set in the contract, but say basically at the same time. And so statistically, we've kind of gone in that 3 to 4 or 5 minutes. If they're dispatched, so one at 1700, one at 1702, but they're both on the, let's say they're both up at by Washington High School. The second unit coming in is then we can request, not necessarily be granted, but can request an exemption for response time criteria on that second call, not on the first one. They are 2 separate calls, 2 separate ambulances are going, but the unit going to that second call can request for an exemption of response time. Because in theory, the unit that was covering that side of town went on the first one, and the second unit had to come from somewhere else in the community.
Gotcha.
Okay, I'm sorry, that was the part I didn't.
Now you're making sense because
Okay.
it's coming from a different location.
Correct, I'm sorry, I didn't say that very well.
Now I got it.
And then your touch base on your code 1, code 2.
Yes.
Do you want me to just go through those quickly? Code 1 through code 4 are just internal system terms that we use to know what mode we're going to the call on. So code 1 in this case is non-emergent, and that means no lights, no sirens. You go immediately, but with the flow of traffic. And no fire, no police. That's not always the rule, but there's no fire on, or I'm sorry, there's no fire on those, but sometimes police goes dependent on area of the community or, those types of things. Code 2 would be, typically your diabetic call is a code 2. No one diabetic, they're unresponsive, think blood sugar's low. Ambulance would go lights and sirens, no fire, no police. Code 3, chest pain call, good example of code 3. Fire, police, ambulance, and of course meet the 8-minute, 59-second response time. And then code 4, really the only thing you add, so that is a code 3 call, and if you just add in the closest unit would go. That's not really applicable for us because we always send the closest unit. It's more applicable for, say, fire, who has a battalion chief driving around in a Suburban, and he may be in the area of a cardiac arrest. He would then know that he needs to go on that call. So,
Got it. Just for clarification, so we knew.
yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Good, yeah.
I do see Councilor Anderson in the audience. If Councilor Anderson had anything he'd like to add, I'd sure invite him to do so.
Thank you for this time. Kenny Anderson, City Council, Northeast District. This is something that Public Services has looked at before in the past over the last couple of years. And after some questions there was some changes made within REMSA. One of the personnel was moved into the health department that does the stats for REMSA. And I thought that was a good move for them. And this audit is another step into clarifying what is public safety here in Sioux Falls, the safety of our citizens. I feel that Sioux Falls Ambulance, or now Rural Metro, has been a good partner with Sioux Falls in providing services. I have a personal experience with them. When a friend had a cardiac event, our first responders are the police, and that's where I feel that our response times really have to make a difference. When the ambulance gets there, I feel that their job is to stabilize that situation further than what the fire department is allowed to do at this time, and then do the transfers. With that being said, I would, knowing that we do not have any informational meetings over the next 2 months or a month and a half, I would like to respectfully request that this audit be moved to Public Services and further looked at by the City Council. Some of my questions would be, Rich, you stated that REMSA approves the user fees.
Yes, the user fees are initially approved by ordinance by the council, and then after that, once a year, they're allowed to approve up to, I think it's 4%, the lesser of the medical CPI, Consumer Price Index, or up to 4%, so I think whichever is less, but REMSA is allowed, is delegated by the city council to do that, and then they have to report that to the city clerk and keep that on record. But the initial rate was set by ordinance by the city council.
Okay.
So if they want to go more than that 4%, REMSA would have to come to the city council and get the approval of that.
That sort of seems like we're letting the horse out of the barn before we approve anything. We're approving it, and then they're actually coming up with a number. Unfortunately, that number is not reported back to the city council. It's given to the clerks, but not the council. In most other cases, when we do user fees, whether it's Parks Department or anywhere else, the city council has the final say on those user fees. So that is something that did catch my eye there that I feel should be checked into. Also, I've asked a question about the physical inspections of the vehicles, and I'm not sure exactly who does the physical inspections, the mechanical inspections. Maybe Mr. Rave could answer that too. But once again, I do respectfully ask that this issue be looked at by leadership and maybe assigned back to public services where this all started. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure. Jill, come on up.
I can perhaps answer both of the questions that were raised by Councilor Anderson, which I'm glad he did. The physical inspection is part of the plan. Julie Charbonneau does do both annual inspections of vehicles, equipment, et cetera, as well as does spot check inspections. And I believe she actually reviewed those with Rich during the audit process.
I have those in my work papers, what she does.
So, those are completed. Second, as far as the annual or when requested user fee increases, those are part of, as Rich explained, the contract, the franchise agreement. It's based on the medical consumer price index, so it would be based on that annual rate that is identified. In some years it's 3%, 3.4%, et cetera. I think it most always has been less than that 4% threshold, and so they go based on the medic, and that's what's outlined in our agreement for ambulance service as well. That has been in the past filed with the clerk's office this year, which might not, since it's a new reporting that we did in May, I believe it was, we did bring that to the city council informational to make you aware of that. So Councilor Anderson, that might have been not quite connected that that's indeed what we did, so they brought those fees forward.
Councilor Intiman.
Jill, just help me to understand a little bit clearer, if you might. So you're saying that our agreement, which was, how many years was this last agreement?
In 2007.
2007. That does allow, based on the index changes, it does allow for kind of an automatic increase. That's part of the contract approval. It does not necessarily need to be approved by the council because it's part of the contract that was approved by the council in 07.
Exactly. So the original fees were approved in the original contract and are part of ordinance, and then built in is that ability to, based on the medical consumer price index, that those fees then, as long as they're less than 4%, they can be an automatic approval that's then submitted to the clerk's office. And then if it's beyond 4%, then that would have to come to the city council for approval. And that is also what's built into the franchise agreement as ordinance.
Okay.
Also, just a note to make sure we understand the audit committee's objective is to accept the report, to analyze the report, determine whether it's been completed and if the procedures were followed through. When Rich presents this to the council, the full council, at an information coming up, that'll be the time for the council to take action on whether we'd like to extend it on and move it on to public services or whatever we would like to do. That would be the time for action. Then this action today is really to accept the report and move it on to the council for further action. So, Rich, do you think that anything that was stated today needs to be added to the report? The report should be extended?
Well,
or?
I think the report's fine. I know Jill had a concern about the, if ultimately the decision is made to hire a consultant, she doesn't have money in her budget for next year, and we're going through the budget right now. So we could always obviously supplement the budget if that decision was made.
Right, that's a very good point. And what we would want to make sure happens when the report is presented from Rich to the full council, that Jill, if you're available, that you're there and tell us that, so that the body knows that it needs to get funded, and if they think it's important, then they'll fund it. Okay, great. Any other questions or comments on this one?
I would move approval.
Okay, we have a motion to approve. I need a second.
Second, Entman.
That's been seconded. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Very good, thank you. Move on to the next audit, water reclamation, industrial billing.
Yeah, this was another request, and we put it on the annual audit plan. It's kind of a complicated thing here. It's a short report, but it's. I'll let Danette introduce it. She did the audit, and I'll let her kind of explain what this industrial billing is.
This, as Rich said, this was a requested audit by management due to the complexity and uniqueness of the billing process for this, this area. The City of Sioux Falls has 12 industrial or regional customers that are billed on a monthly basis, which accounts for about $2 million in our annual revenue. The industrial customers are commercial businesses that have wastewater concentration strengths that are over a set amount. And then the regional customers are other jurisdictions such as Harrisburg and Brandon that have an agreement with the city to provide wastewater treatment for them. Some customers treat their wastewater before it enters our city wastewater facility and therefore are just charged a flat rate per gallon based on the flow rate. And other customers that do not treat their wastewater are charged an additional handling and treatment along with the flow rate. And there's strengths for the wastewater are measured on a sample basis, which is typically a straight random 7-day period per month. And the testing is completed at the Water Reclamation Lab for biochemical oxygen demand, suspended solids, nitrogen, and oil and grease. And each of those has a charge that goes with that based on the average for those. The rates then are billed based on an ordinance, city ordinances, and or individual agreements for the regional customers. And these sample and flow data are entered into an Excel spreadsheet basically, and billing calculations are performed by wastewater treatment staff and then sent over to the utility billing office for the actual invoice creation within the city's invoice system. There was two objectives basically that we were testing in this audit, and they were that the industrial billing process has adequate internal controls and that the billing process is in compliance with established rates. The audit was performed covering the periods of January 2012 through March of 2013, and as part of that I did a sample of 33 billings from that time frame, did some sample collection, process observation, and various other things. Basically what we had found, what I found during the review is that we had incorrect billing rates on some of the sampled billing customers. I had found 7 of them, and when I get to the response to I'll explain that a little bit more. There was 4 that had keying errors, and then there was 1 where an incorrect flow rate was, or flow amount was used. All of the discrepancies that I did find resulted in an underbilling to the customers, and there was never an issue of an overbilling. So it was to the customers' benefit. They were not adversely affected by these in any way. The recommendation that I had is that this process is a complex manual process which can lead to errors. We recommend that additional controls be implemented to reduce the possibility of manual entry errors, along with additional review by someone independent of those performing the calculations to detect errors. Management did provide a response, and it is attached here, and Mark Perry is here as well to answer any questions. I'll kind of recap that. Of the incorrect billing rates that I had found, 7 of them, They, there was 3 of them that they said were correct. I was just not provided the documentation that backed up the rate that was being charged, and that was the discrepancy in that. And the other ones, there were a couple keying errors, and those errors have, basically it was an error in the way the Excel spreadsheet was set up, and that has been corrected. And then one was just a incorrect rate, it was carried over from a prior month. And to reduce the number of keying errors, they're going to try to determine if they can eliminate a double entry of some of the laboratory and flow data that they get from the lab software, to help reduce down the number of possibilities of errors there. And then they also want to try to get a different time frame for doing these calculations. It is a very tight time frame, and currently they have about a day to get the information and put them in the Excel spreadsheets and get the billings turned around. So they are trying to see if they can work with the environmental division that provides some of that data to get them that information by the 15th of each month, and if not, then they're going to consider moving that billing to be a month's time lag. And then they also will be looking at some other extra review, just to make sure that those number of errors are reduced. So with that, if there's any questions.
Any questions for Danette? Mark, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Mark Perry with Public Works Water Reclamation Division. I just wanted to add that I appreciated the audit group doing that audit for us, because it did point out some items that we needed to take some action on, and we've already gotten those into place. And one of them was a secondary review by another individual, so we've done that. And then also another one we are looking into that since this information was put out is the environmental division is looking at and asking the industrial users, and in their agreement, I should back up, that it states in there that they don't have to have the information to the city until the 15th of the month. So some of them will submit it before that, of course, and some of them will submit it right on time or late. So what they're going to attempt to do is ask them to submit it by the 10th of the month, which I think they can meet that goal for us. And then into the future, we'll look at changing those agreements to the 10th of the month, so we have more time. And that would give us, instead of 3 to 5 day window, a 10-day window, and that would drastically reduce the amount of errors, and we'd be able to drop those down.
Good. Councilor Intiman.
Question, you mentioned the agreements in the future. Are these agreements, how often do you revisit the agreement with the industrial users?
I'd have to refer that question to Bob Capel at the Environmental Division. It just depends upon if the industry's changing, their strengths, the amount of flow they're sending to us as to when we would change and renew an agreement with them. So I think Bob typically takes a look at that. Don't quote me on this, but I think it's about every 3 years, I believe.
Okay, and it's not necessary as part of this report, but if you would just have Bob respond, or if you could respond to me about that, I would appreciate it, Mark. Okay. I'm just kind of curious, if an agreement, once it's signed, if it lasts for 15, 20 years, or till a company goes out of business or is sold, those are the kinds of things I'm curious about.
I'll do that.
Okay, thank you.
If I remember right, I think they're reviewed every time that the rates are changed for the regular households, that the industrial users are also, their rates are adjusted at the same time, if I remember. But
those are typically adjusted in the ordinance,
yeah,
on an annual or biannual now basis.
I had a question, if I could. The amount of contamination that occurs month to month to month, do they vary a lot for these 12 industrial users? Do they change from month to month? Do you see a flow between months, or is it always pretty steady?
It depends which industry it is. We typically don't see a lot of variance in those. That's why our and our environmental division takes a look at that, and they determine what the sampling frequency should be. There are certain customers that have to sample every day of the month. There's others where we do samplings on a weekly basis, so we have 7 days to look at. There's others that we bill on flow and not strength.
Okay, interesting. Anything else? Very good, thank you, Mark. I would take a motion to accept this report.
So moved, Rolfing.
Second, Aguilar.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Very good, thank you. Rich, we'll move on to the city-owned real estate.
Yeah, this is a short report. It's the first time we've looked at this area, all the real estate that the city owns, and Kim did this audit, so she'll take it from there. So.
Sounds good. Like Rich said, this is the first time we've done an audit of real estate. We chose to add this to the audit plan because obviously real estate is one of the largest assets of the city. As of May 2013, it was at approximately $134 million. The main purpose of the audit was to acknowledge the value and importance of that asset and to evaluate that the policies and procedures in place used to make decisions regarding the real property are being followed. As people are probably aware, the city acquires real estate for various reasons, anywhere from parks to water lines, drainage, office space, etc. The city's engineering department handles the process of acquisitions and sales of real property. Sales are conducted by a bid process. And then the finance department utilizes their documentation from the transactions to maintain the fixed asset listing. We had 3 objectives in the audit. We evaluated the city's policies and procedures for acquisitions and sales. We also determined if the city's financial system accurately reflected real property owned, and we reviewed the city's real estate inventory management. In our audit work, we selected a sample of 26 acquisitions and 2 sales from a population of approximately 180 from January 2011 through May of this year. We reviewed all the supporting documentation to ensure policies and procedures were followed, and we are reporting that from all the items we tested, we noted that all supporting documentation was in place and on file, and required authorization was obtained when necessary. And we also noted that the financial software was updated timely to reflect all of the transactions. When we looked at completeness, we independently compiled a list of all city-owned real estate by getting listings directly from Minnehaha and Lincoln County. And then we compared those listings back to the fixed asset listing maintained by finance, as well as the maps and lists of property maintained by our GIS department. From the list, we came up with a total of 731 properties, or parcels, that are owned by the city. And we actually traced about 50% of these parcels back from our independently compiled list to the fixed asset listing. And we are happy to report that we noted no discrepancies during that testing as well. When we looked at the policies and procedures regarding city-owned real estate, we did note that there's no formal policy in place to review city-owned real estate as a whole to determine whether parcels have gone stale or, could be utilized in a better form. The directors are asked to review fixed asset listings yearly. Obviously, the fixed asset listings do have the real estate on it, but I don't know that from conversations with management that anyone's really looking closely at those. So we did come up with 2 recommendations. We recommended that the city implement a real estate asset management policy related to acquiring, holding, and disposing of the real property. And that's basically just to acknowledge the value and importance and establish a framework so that the city can make strategic decisions about real estate it owns. If there is empty space that could generate lease income or things that we can sell to free up assets. Management was on board with that. They said they'd coordinate with Public Works to establish an asset management policy. And then kind of in conjunction with that, I kind of stated that already. I guess our second recommendation is that we do apply a strategic approach to the asset management to ensure that the assets are achieving their potential for public benefit, you know, meaning that we don't have a bunch of properties sitting around that aren't on the property tax roll or that could be, like I said, sold to free up assets for other things. So management was also on board with that, that they'd address that within the asset management policy that they are looking at creating. So,
and we did share from other cities some examples of what other cities do with their asset management policy. So
right, and I guess we should note that, I mean, these recommendations aren't coming from a standpoint where there was a lack of internal control or anything like that. It's just a best practice that we found from, like you said, those other reports. So.
Okay, very good. Any questions there?
we were going to have a visual aid, but when we projected it didn't look that great, did it? I mean, showing all a map of the city and all the assets in it.
GIS had made us a map of
Yeah.
all the city-owned property, but you would have needed binoculars.
Yeah, it's a lot of assets.
I can certainly send it to you.
Yeah, or maybe when we
if you
present
want
it to the
but-
council, I could, but it's a little hard on these old eyes to
to get the full picture of the
to
city
get
at
all the
once, so.
individual parcels on there. But
It sounds like management was pretty receptive to the ideas and
Yeah.
moving with those, so that's good. Any questions, anything there? Any motions?
so it'd be my job just to follow up on that, what they indicate they would do. So
Very good. Councilor Rinsman.
That was one question I was going to ask. If you could just remind us again, you know, with the recommendations and the response from management,
Yeah.
can you just remind us again the process that you do for follow-up,
yeah,
please, Rich?
once a year I do a kind of just a summary report for the council for the recommendations of the past year. But you give management about 6 months or so, depending on the audit, and then you follow back and say, so how are we doing on this one? What's going on here? And then, yeah, once a year there's a report, a kind of a summary report of all our audit recommendations and kind of the status of them. So
You give that here, and then?
yes, I give that to the audit. It's a formal report.
Okay, so
That's required by audit standards to have a follow-up process. Yeah.
I remember the report. I just wanted you to remind us so that our listeners and viewers could understand how we follow up with that too. Thank you very much.
Very good, yes.
Move to approve.
Very good, thank you. We need a
Second, Rolfing.
That motion has been seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Very good. We'll move on to the next report, cash handling at the Park and Rec Department.
Yeah, this will be a short one too. Danette, she'll handle this one. So.
Speaking of follow-ups, this was a follow-up audit to an audit that was done in 2009 of the Parks and Rec cash handling. Just to verify, basically this was just to verify that the recommendations that we had issued in that report were implemented as indicated by management. And those specific findings and recommendations were that the checks were not, at that time, the checks were not being restrictively endorsed immediately upon receipt, which is city policy. Receipts were not always being issued for money as it was at the time it was received. Parks and Recreation Management or staff was not reconciling the league fees for the various leagues that the Parks and Rec Department supports as they were being collected. The cash handling duties at the Parks and Recreation office were not properly segregated. The child daily admission fee at Drake Springs Aquatic Center was charged at a rate that was higher than what was authorized in city ordinance at that time. And then two further best practice recommendations were that management should create a written agreement or contract with the summer pool cashiers addressing how they handle the funds that are assigned to their care and what their responsibilities are for that money, and that management should increase the controls over the process of issuing free or reduced rate season pool passes. As part of the audit, we looked at January 2012 through May 2013 transactions and a lot of observation and sampling of receipts and so forth. Our review of the process indicated that all the recommendations made in that prior audit report have been implemented to the full extent that they can be. The only one that is kind of hard is the segregation of duties, but given the limited size of the staff in that office, it is the best that it can be. So they have tried very hard to implement all those things and have done a very good job with that. So.
Very good. This is a follow-up as well. Is there any questions or comments about that report? Councilor Rolfe.
Just that this is the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
We find a problem and everybody works together, and with that in mind, I'll move approval of the report.
Second, Aguilar.
Very good. That's been, motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Very good. Thank you. Last one is the Downtown River Greenway.
Yes, Downtown River Greenway, it's been a controversial project. This was requested, I think we had it on I believe the 2012 audit plan, and I think we had kind of carried over into 2013. But anyway, we finally got that done, and the project, the phase 2, is almost complete downtown. I think the one holdup is the construction of that Hilton Garden Inn on the east bank there. The project would be pretty much done, but they've had to kind of wait for that to be finished before they get that water feature hooked up, because they rely upon the electricity and the water from the hotel to get down to the bank there. So that's the only holdup there. I'd say it's about 95% complete or better. I think there'll be a ribbon cutting shortly, official celebration of the phase 2. So that phase 1 of the project was between 6th and 8th Street, and that was completed last year. Phase 2 is obviously going to be completed here, and that kind of continued south from phase 1. Mostly on the east bank, but there's a little bit of improvement on the west bank too. And so originally this, looking back at the background on page 2 of the report, this goes all the way back to the original Greenway master plan in 1975 that envisioned this bike path following the river, and that bike path was finally completed. That 20-mile loop was completed in 2007, and then the need was seen to further develop the river, the bike path downtown, so to speak. And beginning in 2003 through 2004, they came up with the plan that was ultimately approved by the City Council in September of 2004, the Riverfront Master Plan. And the public was consulted and identified various features that they would like to see. And the big problem, though, or several problems with this project, were funding. There just wasn't adequate funding for what it needed to be done. And but that was resolved as money was found and authorized by the City Council. And then the other problem was, obviously, once the construction begins, it's very complicated construction when you're putting retaining walls in a river. You've got the force of the river and the moisture. The construction techniques get a little more complicated, more expensive. For example, the retaining walls also have to be stronger because you have the force of the water, especially if there's a flood. You make sure those retaining walls are strong enough to withstand high water or flooding. They talked about epoxy coating on some of the materials because it's going to be underwater or exposed to water. Another big problem was the bedrock. When they started actually constructing, the depth of the bedrock varied considerably. One spot it would be this depth, and then a few more feet, and it would dramatically change. So that added to the cost of the contract, and obviously constructing temporary coffer dams so that you could have a dry environment in which to work. So we noted that there were several funding sources. Obviously, the second penny was kind of the workhorse for the project, but there was that Culture and Rec bond that was issued, known as that Quality of Life 2, that bond issue of $5 million. And then there was this money that was held in trust. It wasn't taxpayer dollars. It was almost $2 million. It was money that was in a trust fund from the mid-1990s. There was a fine imposed by the federal government upon John Morrell for dumping in the river back around 95, 96 or so. And a federal judge had authorized this money to be placed in trust until a suitable project could be identified. And so finally, in a few years ago, the city came up with the project which they thought would meet the criteria that the judge had set up before they could spend the money out of this trust fund. and there was almost $2 million in that trust fund. That really helped a lot for this project. And at the bottom of page 5, there was 3 specific things that the council did to increase the funding for this project outside of the normal CIP process, the normal capital budget. In 2009, there was that quality of life bond issue, and that was about $5 million. Then the council authorized the use of the trust fund. Ultimately, though, the federal judge had to approve that. So but the city council approved that by resolution. That was almost $2 million, and that was not taxpayer dollars. That was the fine money. And then last year, there was a supplemental appropriation. We had a surplus in capital funds. Council approved about $1 million there. So that's where the funding came from. And one of the big questions was, why is this so expensive? I think I've explained why this was so expensive. And we did conclude, though, that there was never a case of construction beginning without, or a contract let without budget authority in place. Obviously, the scope of the project changed a lot from 2004 to what it became. The cost of the project became much more expensive. But there was always, management was always very careful before they bid a contract or authorize a contract, that they sought approval from the council for supplemental appropriations so that the project was fully funded. And then we also looked at the internal controls, for construction project. In other words, do we have internal controls in place? Is somebody checking the, for example, is the concrete the right thickness and the right strength? Is that being done? Is somebody monitoring what the SWIFT, the general contractor, is doing? Is that being inspected? Their work. Are we doing the proper testing? Are we reviewing the pay request in detail when they come through every month? Is somebody doing that? Checking the mathematical accuracy, looking at their log of what work was done and what payment is requested. We looked at the insurance. Is the proper insurance in place? And those sort of things. And we found that the likely risks were being identified and were being properly mitigated between the engineering staff, the consultant that we hire for project administration, and then the park department's Tori, who is the park development specialist. And so we thought, and also there was good coordination going on. They had weekly meetings every Wednesday down at, I think it was the CNA building, to coordinate with the construction of the Hilton Garden Inn and any other interested parties. A lot of coordination had to be done for this project, and we saw that was happening and being documented. So if you have any questions, I had no recommendations on this. Everything was as it should be. We found no evidence that they were spending more money than they're authorized. So
That's a good outcome. Yes. Any questions for Rich on this report? I'd entertain a motion to approve.
So move, Entenmann.
Second, Forbes.
That motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Good, thank you, Rich. Item number 4 is a travel request. Rich, what do you got?
This is one I've been to in the past a couple of times. You should have a copy of that. It's from their website, the Inter-Governmental Audit Form. It's a collection of federal, state, and local auditors that meet in various regions, at least once a year in their various regions. On the last page, or page 3 at the top there, the one that's closest to us and the one I've attended twice in the past is the one down in the Kansas City area. So it's a request to for their December conference. I would leave on Wednesday the 4th, and the conference would be on that Thursday, Friday, December 5th and 6th. Total cost would be around $500. It's pretty cheap. They don't charge a lot. The speakers are normally other auditors, so there's not a lot of speaker staff to pay for, and it's a good chance also to network with a lot of other auditors at the 3 levels of government. So.
I can't help but ask, does that have anything to do with ALGA?
No. This is separate from ALGA.
All right, I'm sorry, I shouldn't. $500 does seem pretty reasonable. It's close.
Yeah.
And obviously, we have money in our budget. We're all set for that.
Yeah, there should be enough money in the budget for that. If not, I won't go. But I think as of now, I think we have enough money in there. So good.
Okay. Rich, do we need to approve that?
Yes, and then I would have I'll fill out a travel request and have the council chair, I believe, sign that. So.
Anybody like to make a motion to approve Rich's travel?
So moved.
Very good. That motion has been made and seconded. Councilor Aguilar. Motion made by Rolfe. That's okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Very good. Open discussion. Anybody have anything that they'd like to talk about or add? Rich, did you have anything?
I have nothing.
Okay, very good. I see an executive session on the agenda, but that's just as a placeholder. We have no executive session needed. If there's no other business, I would entertain an adjournment motion.
So moved. Forbes.
Second Aguilar.
Very good. We have a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.